All right. Thank you for joining us today for part 2 in our series on the district and building report card. Today, we're going to focus on gap closing. And the reason we chose that is there was a lot of changes to gap closing. So as we go along, if you have any questions, feel free to let us know. Today's agenda, we're going to start and we'll take a look at gap closing as it was previously on the report card. I know we haven't had a component grade for a few years. So we'll look at what that looked like prior to the changes that we just saw. Then we'll take a look at all the new things that appear on the new gap closing component. And then we'll finish up with some questions and just some general next steps that you might have. All right, so if we were to think about the previous gap closing component, there were really 4 main components. So we had English language arts proficiency, math proficiency, graduation rates, and English learner progress. ELA, math, and graduation all had a similar feel to them. So the way that those were graded is you could have up to 10 subgroups, and each subgroup could earn up to 100 points. And with that, the way that you earn points is a subgroup could automatically earn the full 100 points by meeting the goal that was set in ESSA for that year. And those goals gradually increase each year. The second way they could meet that is for ELA and math only. And that was if they had a gain index of at least +1 in terms of progress. So in our previous series, we went through the progress indicator or the progress component. So they're using that same idea there, but it was broken down for individual subgroups and looking at either their math or their ELA score. So +1 or greater, they could get the full 100 points for each subgroup. And then the last thing is if they showed improvement, and you could do this for ELA, for math, or for graduation. If you didn't quite meet the goal, but you showed improvement from the previous year, then you got partial points depending on how close you were to that goal. For the English learner progress, this one is pretty similar. It did not make many changes, but you used to have a yearly goal. And if you met it, you got full points, just like the other ones. You could also show at least 10% improvement. So if your group of EL students showed at least 10% improvement, you got the full credit for that, or the 100 points there. And then lastly, show improvement from previous years. Again, in that situation, you could get partial credit. What we would then do is we would take all 4 of the measures. In this example that I'm giving you, there were only 3 because many cases we don't have enough EL students to calculate that. And we see that in many of our districts here in Stark County. That they may not have enough. So they may have only been looking at 3, like this example is, and we average those percentages together. And my example here was a 93.3%, which would have been an A. Now, that being said, let's talk about demotions, because this is an area where demotions were fairly common because there was quite a few things that you could get a demotion for. The first thing was if any one of your subgroups had a low performance in their ELA or their math. So, and a low performance was defined by below 60% or below 60 as far as that, that individual goal. So it's a little bit lower. Now, there were times that this low indicator was actually higher than the ESSA goal. So sometimes we would meet or get points for our group, but we'd still get a deduction because we had a low performance there for that individual subgroup. A lot of times we would see this in the students with disabilities category. Another way that you could get a deduction is a low graduation rate in one of your subgroups, or the third way is low participation rate in any of your subgroups on those ELA and math tests. So if we had our group like we have right here, and let's say we had to take a deduction under the old system, it was automatically 10%. With one exception. It was possible to get a 10% deduction if you scored 100%, and you would still earn an A. So there was that extra little asterisk in there that said you can't get an A if you have any demotions. So we would run into some situations where we'd actually have 100%, but that group would get demoted to I think it was like an 89.9%, just to put them under the amount needed to get that A. So they would end up with a B for that. So we can see that any demotion is taking 10% off that final annual measurable objective. And again, you could not get an A before with any deduction. All right. So that was kind of the old system. We kind of went through that fast, but I just wanted you guys to have an idea or a reminder of what the old system was like before we jump to the new changes that we see. So the first one is the gifted indicators, or indicator, was really split into three parts. And they were the same three parts that they used to be, but now points are assigned a little bit different. And those were moved from achievement to gap closing. So we'll take a look at those. That'll be one of the first groups that we look at, the gifted indicators. Chronic absenteeism was also moved over. So it was in achievement before as well, and they needed a place to put it. So they moved it over to gap closing. And then they just put it on hold for this year. So as you're looking at your data for this year, you're going to notice that they didn't include chronic absenteeism. And that was some late legislation that was passed to just put it off one more year because of pandemic-related consequences, I guess I would say there. So for that, they just held that off for 1 year. But it will be on next year's report card. We will see that chronic absenteeism. The third thing is updated goals for our subgroups. So with our old ESSA plan, we had goals for each of our subgroups. They were set out and they gradually increased every year. With the pandemic, we kind of did a reset here, and we have a new baseline of last year to determine our goals going forward for each year. When Mary Ann presented to us earlier in the year, she said that those goals had been sent away to the federal government, and they are still waiting approval as far as I'm aware. So I just pulled some more information today, and it looks like they're still waiting for approval on those. So we'll talk about that when we do see those later on in the presentation. The fourth thing is progress and performance used to be together. And if you didn't meet the one area, you could then meet that goal by progress. Those have now been separated. So we have our ELA performance index. We also have our ELA progress, and the same thing for math. So that really creates a few more points that are possible as we're looking at this. The fifth thing that you see there is partial points for improvement have been removed. So in many cases, if we do show improvement, but we don't meet that goal that's established in the ESSA plan, then no points are awarded for that subgroup. So that's just one of those pieces that they took out that could make things a little bit more challenging down the road. And then the last thing that we'll talk about is changes to demotions. So we changed what we're calling those demotions, and there's a new way of calculating it that I feel like is much fairer than what we saw before. So let's go ahead and jump into gifted indicators. So we're going to start with progress because we talked about that last week. And with progress, we have we can get either 0 or 5 points. I guess there is a third option. In some buildings, you may not have gifted progress available. We saw this as we looked at report cards. Some of our K1 buildings or K2, even K3 buildings would not have progress. We really see progress come in once we get to fourth grade. So it is possible that if you're looking at a building report card, this indicator may not actually be there, or this part of the calculation may not count at all. But for most of us, we're going to have either get a 0 on this or 5 points on this, depending on whether we met 3 stars or higher. So that is the criteria. As you look at progress, 3 stars or higher gets you the 5 points needed for this. The thing that'll get a little tricky, and with this, we had not many districts, but a couple of districts that had questions on, well, why didn't I get a progress report? And as you're looking at this, you can only count students who are taking a test that they have been identified gifted in. So for example, if I have a student that is taking the ELA test, that will only count if that student's identified as superior cognitive or reading or English there to count as a student that is needed. And we need 6 students for any test to get a progress report for that. So that gets a little tricky. You may, as a district, have 25 or 30 students, but what ends up happening is you only have 5 in each of those tests, so they're unable to calculate a value added or a progress score for that. So that does get a little confusing, and some of our smaller districts or possibly a smaller building may run into that situation. Okay, so just gave you a little example here. This is what the report looks like when we pull this up on EVOS's site. And last week when we looked at this, we paid attention to the overall a little more. Today, we're going to look at that gifted. So this example right here, they had a negative 1.63. And if you fall anywhere above -2 as your index, that's going to give you a 3-star or higher rating. So as we're looking at this, we really don't even need to pay attention to the effect size, because a 3-star, a 4-star, or a 5-star will all give us the 5 points. So this sample district that we have, they met this indicator and they would earn the 5 points. Okay. The next part then is Gifted Performance Index. And Gifted Performance Index is where we assign different values based upon the performance level on the test. So this one also is a 0 or 5 points. And I jumped ahead a little bit there. This one, the goal that you need is going to change a little bit in the next couple of years. So this year, you needed 95% of the maximum score to meet the target here or meet this indicator. Next year, it goes up to 96.5, and the following year, it goes up to 97.5. Now, the other change that they made here is the max score used to always be 120. And the way they came up with that is you could get, if 100% of your students scored advanced on the test, that would give you a performance index of 120. So they used to use that as the max score. And then as they were recalculating this for achievement, they said, well, instead of using the max score, it's more fair if we use the highest 2% of all the buildings or the districts, depending on which type of report card we're looking at. Now, when we do that for a gifted, that actually makes this number higher in some situations. So when we look at the top 2% of districts, and we're just looking at students that are gifted and took a test in their the area that they are identified gifted in, you can see that the maximum score for those districts was 120.489. So it was actually higher than the 120 that we used previously. When we drop that down and are looking at individual buildings, it's even higher. And we have 121.114 this year was the max there. And the reason that you can get some of those higher numbers is because for our students that are accelerated, so they're taking a course ahead of where they are grade-wise, they can get the level of Advanced Plus on the test. And that has a weight of a 1.3. So technically, if all of your students scored Advanced Plus on the test, you could actually get a score of 130. I don't know that I've ever seen that, but that technically that's how we have our max being above that 120 that it used to be. Okay. As we look at the performance index, we can see that they're assigning a different weight for each of the areas or each of the performance levels, and that weight increases a little bit every time you move up a level. So for our example right here, we had a performance index of 106.52. And if I divide that, we're going to pretend this was a district. And if I divide that by the max score that we have over here to the left of 120.489, we'll get an 88.4%. And for 2022, that just wasn't high enough. So we needed that 95 to meet that indicator. So in this example, we did not earn the 5 points, and we'll come back and we'll keep that in mind when we add all our points up for gap closing at the end. All right, now the next one seems like it could be an indicator or a component all by itself, because there's a lot involved in this one. And this is, we used to call it input points. They're now referring to it as gifted ID and services. And it's pretty similar. They did make some changes to this, but a lot of the ideas are the same as what it was when we had input points. So for that, in 2022, the goal was to get 60% of the possible points. We can see in 2023, that's going to go up to 70%. And 2024, we're up to 80%. And that's pretty comparable to what it was previous. So we're just gradually working our way up with those. Now, the areas that we look at is, so for ID and service for Superior Cog and specific academics there, those are the first two. And there's a pretty good amount of points that we'll take a look at in the future, or in the next couple minutes here. Our next area is creativity and VPA. We have an area for ID. We also have an area for service there. And then the last one is the representative index. And this is the part that changed with the intentions of making this more fair, especially to our smaller districts. And there was a possibility that maybe this would not be included if you didn't have enough representation from a certain group. So with this is looking at our economically disadvantaged and our underrepresented minorities here. And we'll take a closer look at those in a few minutes. All right, so let's start out with our Superior Cog and specific academic identification and service. So on the top here, these are my blue boxes, and you can see that for identification, the one thing that really popped out to me when I was looking at this is that K2 band. The K2 band, there's up to 15 points can be earned for that category. And then for all the other categories, 3 through 6, 7, 8, 9, 12, those are each worth 5 points. One of the things that we ran into, and one of the things that many districts noticed there is for a lot of us, we're not identifying in that K1 band. So it gets a little difficult to earn the full 15 points for that. Now, when we come over to service, that one, each of these boxes here, they're all equally weighted. So up to 10 points. One of the things that I can tell you that I noticed as I was working with several of our districts, many of our districts didn't have enough students served in that K2 group. So if you don't have enough students served in that K2 group, which is 15 students, then that doesn't count against you anymore. So they just leave those 10 points out of the total amount. And I did that in our example as well. So when we look at actual values or numbers that you'll see here, you'll notice that we didn't get the full points for the identification. And then because we had less than 15 for the service, that one did not count at all. All right, so if I jump down, then my next band there, or my next section, has to do with ID and service of our creative thinkers and our VPA, our visual and performing arts there. So for that one, we can earn up to 5 points for IDing them. We can also earn up to 5 points for servicing those kiddos there. Down at the bottom of the page here, what I did is I put a little link so that you can see what the breakdowns are to receive the different values. So what do I need to get 15 points for my identification of K2 up at the top there, instead of only earning 12 points? So if you click on that link, you'll be able to see the complete breakdown. Just for time, we're not going to jump in and look at that today, but it is there. If you have questions, always feel free to reach out and we can talk through those things there. Before I talk about, let's talk about a building in terms of these two things before we jump to the representative index. So building looks a little bit different in that we wouldn't have these grade bands here. So what happens for the blue boxes at the top is they're all combined to K12. So for that, you can get up to 30 points for identification in the superior cog and specific academic ability. And then for service, those are all combined as well. So it just says K12, and you can get up to 40 points there if you're looking at a building. And the scales are a little bit different. And again, they're included down here. If you click the link, you can see all the scales for the district and for the building because they're a little bit different. All right, the next part is the representative index. And for that, you can see, again, we have our identification and our service, and these are broken up into economically disadvantaged. So for identification, we can get 20 points, and for service, we can get 10. The same thing happens for underrepresented minorities there, 20 points for our ID, 10 points for our service. Now, give you an example of how this is going to work because it is different. It's new here. And basically, if we have the example here is we have Motley City Schools district has an enrollment of 1,000 students. Of those 1,000 students, 200 are identified as economically disadvantaged, which equals a ratio of 200 to 1,000, or we could say that is 20%. So that's the ratio of all students. Now we're going to take a look at the ratio of gifted students with economically disadvantaged, who are economically disadvantaged, I should say. So there are 300 gifted students in our school, and 25 of them are economically disadvantaged. So with that, the ratio there, 25 to 300, or that ends up being 8% of the students that are economically disadvantaged are gifted. So with that, we are then going to divide those two. And what the state says is that anything above 0.1 would be those are proportional. And that's our goal. Like we want these underrepresented groups to, have the same representation as our general population. And that's where they're assigning points here. Anything below 0.8, they're considering not proportional. So you start to see that the points go down for anything under that 0.8. So if we take our 8%, we divide it by 20%, we get a 0.4. And so for this section, we only get 4 points. All right, now, I know that's a lot. So the next part is where it got really tricky for me too, because on all of the other areas here, as we were looking at them, when we moved over and looked at the service, we were comparing the service to the amount that were identified. And so this is that doesn't happen here when we're looking at the representative index. So it doesn't follow that same pattern that we did for VPA and for creativity and superior cog in those specific academic ability there. So in this situation, you'll notice that step 1 and step 2, there was no change. So in step 2 or in step 3, now we're looking at the service of students. So of the 250, we service 250 of our gifted students at this school district, and 25 of those that are serviced, which was actually the same number as before, are identified as economically disadvantaged. So 25 out of 250 is my example. That's going to be a 10% of the students. And so then what we would do is we'd create that same ratio and we would divide, and then it would get put on a scale to assign points. Again, we're still not to that 0.8 that we're looking for. So we would not receive the full amount that's possible, that full 10 points. With that, I know that some of our districts, they serve 100% of the students that they identified in these groups. So they served everyone that they've identified, but because we're comparing to the overall population and not comparing our service to those that are identified, you can see that it's not, we're not getting that bump that we might have on some of the other categories. So I know that that's something that has given several people some trouble there, but the calculation that's set up is comparing it to the proportion of economically disadvantaged students in the district to the total enrollment in the district. So there's that's how that part, that service part, will be calculated there going forward. All right, so now that we have those all together, what I kind of did is I just made up some numbers here, some examples of what point values that we may have gotten. So we can see for my identified, a little bit lower in that K2, and I think we saw that in many of our districts just because of that not having as many students identified in that K1 range. And then the other bands, you can see that we did pretty well in our sample data here. The serve part for K2, I'm going to assume that I didn't have 15 students in that first section. So that's why you can see right here, I have a 0 out of 0. So that box or that group will not count for me as I'm calculating this. In the other areas, we're doing a pretty good job of servicing, with the exception of our 3 through 6 band there. We only got an 8 out of 10. The other ones, we got full points for servicing our students. K2 for creativity, or K12 for creativity and visual VPA. Those were each worth 5, and we assigned some points there. And then for economic, for our representative index down here, you can see those values as well. And if we put it all together, we got an 81 total points out of 135, and that ended up being a 60%. So based on 2022, we needed a 60% to meet that indicator or that section of the gifted indicators, and we were right at the mark there. So we will say that that was met. Okay, so those are our 3 gifted indicators. There's a lot going on there. I know our Diana Opplinger at our ESC has spent a decent amount of time speaking with many of the gifted coordinators about this and answering questions. But if you have any, please feel free to reach out at any time and we'll try our best to answer those. Okay, so let's jump now to ELA and math achievement. So this one that we see right here, I'm going to start with math, and there are 10 subgroups for each subject. So the one that's often forgotten the most is all students. So that's usually gives us 10. Many of our districts are not going to have all 10. Some of our districts may only have 3 or 4, and that's okay. We're only calculating for the ones that apply to your district. So in order for a subgroup to be included, you need at least 15 students. And then with that, 1 point is awarded for each subgroup goal met. So in our example here for math, we can see we didn't do the greatest. We struggled a little bit. We're actually, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to put up these goals that are still pending approval. But they were used on this report card. So the column that you see highlighted there is what we needed to meet that subgroup goal. This example, you can see all of the subgroups. They didn't have all 10. It looks like they only had 8 subgroups there. And if you look really closely at that, you're going to see that 3 out of the 8 subgroups, they met that goal. So for this section of gap closing, we're going to get 3 out of the 8 points. Again, there is no credit for improvement or anything like that. It's just you either met the goal or you didn't. All right, so this one is language arts. And for language arts achievement, you can see that this group did a great job. So they've met every single one of their indicators. I'll bring up those pending approval goals off to the side so that you can see those. And if we're looking at this, 7 out of 7 for ELA achievement. Now, again, these goals were reset this year, so you may notice if you were to go back and compare them to what the goals were previously set to be, that they're significantly lower. But the one thing to keep in mind is that they are set to increase every single year until we get out to 2030, 2031. Unless there's recalibrating of those somewhere along the way. But they are pending. This is what they have planned to go forward for 2030 to 2031. Okay. So the next thing that we'll talk about is growth. And this is the one that was very, very challenging. So we talked about progress last time. This is set up very similar to achievement as far as there's 10 subgroups for each math and ELA. The one thing that's very different from the previous one is before, as a bonus or as an extra try, I would say, if you didn't meet the achievement goal but you had a +1 as your growth index, then you would meet that goal for that subgroup. Well, they've increased that goal to +2.0. So if you joined us last week for progress, you're going to notice that that's like each subgroup getting a 4-star or a 5-star. And it's a very challenging goal to get that. And again, it's by each subgroup. So it's looking at each subgroup individually. It is possible sometimes that you'll find that you have a subgroup in the achievement part of this, but you may not have that same subgroup in the progress part. And that goes back to, in order for them to calculate progress, they need at least more than 5 students at a tested area. So, and then they can combine them after the fact. But if you have a bunch of singletons or something like that, especially in a small building, you may run into something where you have a smaller subgroup or one missing subgroup there. This group did really well. So we can see that red line is that +2 for the growth index. And it looks like every single one of our groups here actually are above that +2 for the growth index. So we're going to go ahead and assign them 8 out of 8 points. And then we'll take a look at ELA. So ELA, this kind of flipped from that example that we looked at earlier where they did really well in achievement and then math was a struggle. Here it looks like the ELA, they did not meet that +2 in any of the areas. So actually we don't see that red line because it's not showing up on the graph that they're providing us because all of our growth index is below that +2 there. Okay, so in this area, we received 0 out of 8 points for growth. All right, so graduation. Now, as we look at graduation, very similar to what we saw before, we have some new goals. And this is a situation where when we send our proposal to the federal government, these goals actually became harder or more challenging than what we previously had established in our old ESSA plan. So as they were reaching out and trying to lower the goals in math and ELA, the data said that they should probably increase their goals in graduation. So you might notice that some of these goals are higher than what they were previously. There's still 10 subgroups, and you get 1 point for every subgroup goal that is met. So if we're looking at this right here, we can see that our first 5 or our top 5, we met the goal or exceeded the goal. And then the last one there, our economically disadvantaged, we were just below what we needed. So we're going to get 5 out of 6 points for graduation. Okay. English learner progress. So again, this one, another one where you need 15 students to be included. Some of our districts will not have this piece. So they may get a 0 out of 0 or an NC on this part of gap closing, and that just means that it's not calculated in. The way that you can meet this goal is the way that you can get the 5 points is you can either meet the goal or show improvement from the previous year. The improvement is not a straightforward, just improve any amount and you get it. It's going to calculate some additional factors and you have to increase a certain amount from previously. So it's not any improvement, it's a certain amount of improvement there. So 0 or 5 points if you have 15 students. And our example here is we had a 72.5 there, and we can see that our goal for this year was a 43.05, or if I round that, a 43.1. And I want to say prior to this being reset, we were up in the 60s, maybe even the 70s. So you can see that that did get pushed back from what it was. And so with that, this group met the indicator. So they would get 5 out of 5 points there. All right, so the next, and I believe this is the last one, part of this is chronic absenteeism. And this was the one that was put on hold for 21-22 because of the pandemic, but it will be reintroduced on next year's report card. For this one, you can meet the current absenteeism goal, or you can show improvement from the prior year. And for that one, there's some different calculations depending on where your baseline was. So if you were over a certain amount, you can meet it one way by showing improvement. If you're under a certain amount, then you can meet it a different way. And I'll put the link in for the technical document so that you can see those actual calculations. But that second part, you can meet this goal by showing improvement. Our goal for this year was a 22.1, and this one, the goal will go down each year as we get closer to that 2030, 2031. Okay. Since we did not have this, I just put 0 out of 0 points here because it's not included in this year's report card. All right, so let's pull everything that we talked about in our sample district together right here. So you can see all the points that were awarded and how many points were possible for each category. Going back to when we first started talking, we started with gifted progress, which was a 5 out of 5. So if I add those all up, my points earned would be 38 and my points possible would be 57. Now, before we come up with a final rating here, we have to look if we need any demotions or if there's a demotion that I need to assign to this. Before I say anything more about demotions, we're going to call them proportional adjustment. So I really like that wording there. It sounds much nicer than the word demotion. So we're calling it a proportional adjustment for that. So with that, we're only going to receive a proportional adjustment based on our participation rate. So we're not going to get it by a low ELA score or a low math score or a low graduation. They're just looking at the participation rate. So for that, we have, I put together a little graph here with our participation rates. And what we're really going to do is we're going to combine for our all students. So for our all students, we're going to combine math and ELA. And you can see that when I did that for my group that I have right here, I'm going to end up with a 97% participation rate. And with that, anything over 95%, we do not need a proportional adjustment. So we only do a proportional adjustment if we're below or less than that 95% participation rate. So when we come back to our rating, we're not going to do this, but I want to show you an example of what it looks like if we needed to do this adjustment. So I changed our numbers, I adjusted them a little bit, and you can see that instead of a 95% participation rate, I adjusted that so that it's a 93.6. So in this example, we're a little bit below. So the way that we determine that is we're going to take our participation rate and we're going to divide it by that 95%. So I'm going to take 93.6, divide it by 95, and I get a 0.985. And then that 0.985, if I multiply that by the points that I originally earned, which previously were 38, you can see that I'm going to have an adjusted score for this component of a 37.44. So because I barely missed by participation rate, they're not dropping me down an entire letter grade, or they're not taking a full 10% off of my score. They're just adjusting it by how close I was to that 95% participation rate there. Okay, so as you can see, I feel like that's a little bit more fair than it was previously. Okay, so let's go back to our gap closing component. So going back, we had no adjustment needed there, 38 out of 57 points. If I were to divide that out, a 66.7% is the score that I have. And you can see that our grading scale is over to the right. And for that, anything above a 60% is going to earn you 5 stars. So as we look at that, I think there were several things that were taken into account. And one of them being that as we go forward, we're going to see that those goals are going to increase every year. So it's going to be harder and harder to hit that 60%. With that, we know that in different areas like gifted, we're going to see the amount that we need to hit the input points is going to go up each year or increase gradually the next couple of years, as is our performance index. So we have several things that are gradually going to increase. We saw this year that meeting those points because of progress is going to be a challenge. So as we look at this and we see that scale does seem fairly low, one of those reasons might be that the state is aware that things are going to increase and become more challenging as we go forward in the next couple of years. Okay, so as far as next steps, just we know that those are future goals. As far as I'm aware, at this point on October 19th, those are not set or approved yet, but we're hoping to hear back soon if they are. But just be aware of like how those are changing going forward, what's going to be expected next year. Those are important next steps as you're preparing for this component in the future. So for today, that's all I have, but I want to remind you that we have one more session coming up, and that is achievement, early literacy, and graduation. So we're going to combine those all together next week. So same time, same channel next week, 1 o'clock to 2 o'clock, and we'll talk about those 3 things combined. So